The day the homeless man found a wallet full of money, and the unexpected happened. Asterisk. The rain hammered against the concrete like bullets from heaven, each drop exploding into 1,000 fragments that seemed to mirror the shattered pieces of Thomas Wright's life. But Thomas wasn't Thomas anymore. He was just another ghost haunting the streets of downtown Chicago, invisible to the rushing crowds who stepped over him like he was nothing more than debris. What nobody knew, what nobody could have possibly imagined, was that this particular Tuesday night in October would change everything. Not just for Thomas, but for everyone whose life would intersect with his in the most impossible way. Thomas pulled his torn jacket tighter around his shoulders, the cardboard beneath him already soaked through from the relentless downpour. His stomach cramped with hunger. It had been 3 days since he'd eaten anything substantial. The shelter was full, the churches were closed, and the few dollars he'd managed to scrape together from kind strangers had been stolen while he slept 2 nights ago. He closed his eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to have hope, but the memory was as distant as the stars hidden behind the storm clouds. That's when he saw it. A small leather object lying in the gutter, partially hidden beneath a crumpled newspaper. At first, Thomas thought it was just another piece of trash, another reminder of the world's carelessness. But something about the way the streetlight caught its edge made him crawl forward, his knees scraping against the wet pavement. His fingers, numb from the cold, fumbled as he reached for what he now recognized as a wallet. The wallet was expensive, genuine leather, still warm from someone's pocket. Thomas's heart began to race as he opened it, expecting to find maybe $20 or $30 if he was lucky. But what he found inside made his breath catch in his throat. $100 bills, lots of them, more money than he'd seen in years. His hands trembled as he counted. $5,000 in cash, maybe more. For a moment, the rain seemed to stop. The world seemed to pause, and Thomas felt like he was dreaming that. But then reality crashed back down on him harder than the storm. This wasn't his money. Someone had lost this wallet, someone who was probably desperately searching for it right now. Thomas looked at the driver's license tucked behind the bills. Rebecca Martinez, 34 years old, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. An address in Lincoln Park, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. She was beautiful, successful looking. Everything Thomas had once been before his world collapsed. Thomas sat there in the rain, holding $5,000 in one hand and his conscience in the other, unaware that Rebecca Martinez was not at all who she appeared to be, and that this moment would trigger a chain of events that would test everything he thought he knew about human nature, justice, and the thin line between salvation and destruction. Thomas stared at the address on the driver's license, his mind racing through possibilities. The smart thing would be to keep the money. After all, who would miss $5,000 from Lincoln Park? Rich people lost more than that on a bad day at the stock market. He could eat for months, maybe find a place to stay, get cleaned, up, start over. But as he looked at Rebecca's photo again, something in her eyes reminded him of his daughter Sarah, the daughter he hadn't seen in 5 years, the daughter who probably thought he was dead. The internal battle raged for 20 minutes as Thomas sat in the rain, the wallet growing heavier in his hands with each passing second. Finally, he made his decision. He would return it. Not because he was a saint, but because somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of pain and disappointment, he was still the man who had once been a father, a husband, a decent human being before the economy crashed and took his construction. Business with it. The journey to Lincoln Park took 3 hours on foot. Thomas didn't have money for the train, and the buses had stopped running. His worn shoes leaked with every step, and his clothes clung to his skin like a second soggy skin. But he pressed on, driven by something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the last flicker of the man he used to be. When he finally reached the address, Thomas stopped dead in his tracks. The building was a luxury high-rise, the kind with doormen and marble lobbies and residents who had never known what it felt like to wonder where their next meal was coming from. Security cameras tracked his movement as he approached the entrance, and Thomas was acutely aware of how he must look, a homeless man dripping wet, approaching a building where his presence would be seen as a threat. The doorman, a middle-aged man with suspicious eyes and a uniform that probably cost more than Thomas had earned in his last month of work, stepped forward before Thomas could even reach the door. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move along. This is private property." Thomas held up the wallet, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found this. It belongs to Rebecca Martinez. I just want to return it." The doorman's expression changed, but not in the way Thomas expected. Instead of relief or gratitude, something that looked almost like fear flickered across his face. "Rebecca Martinez? Are you sure?" "It's her driver's license," Thomas said, opening the wallet to show the identification. "I found it in the street. I just want to give it back." The doorman stared at the wallet for a long moment, then at Thomas, then back at the wallet. Finally, he shook his head slowly. "Sir, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but Rebecca Martinez doesn't live here anymore. She hasn't lived here for over a year." Thomas felt his world tilt. "But this is the address on her license." "Ma'am died in a car accident 14 months ago," the doorman said quietly. "Tragic thing. She was such a nice lady. But whoever's wallet that is, it's not hers. Rebecca Martinez is buried in Graceland Cemetery." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Dead. The woman whose money he held, whose address he had walked 3 hours to reach, was dead. But if she was dead, then whose wallet was this? And why did it have her identification? Thomas stood frozen on the sidewalk, the wallet feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds in his hands. The doorman's words echoed in his mind. Rebecca Martinez was dead, had been dead for over a year. But the driver's license looked recent. The photo crisp and clear. Nothing about this made sense. "Sir," the doorman said, his voice gentler now, "maybe you should take that to the police. Something's not right here." But Thomas barely heard him. His mind was racing back to the moment he'd found the wallet, replaying every detail. The way it had been positioned in the gutter, almost like it had been placed there deliberately. The fact that despite the heavy rain, the inside had been completely dry. The unusual warmth of the leather, as if it had just been taken from someone's pocket. These details, which he dismissed in his excitement, now seemed significant. Thomas thanked the doorman and turned away, his footsteps echoing in the empty street. The rain had stopped, but the storm in his mind was just beginning. He found a bench under a streetlight and carefully examined the wallet again. Behind Rebecca's driver's license, he found a business card he'd missed before. Martinez Investigations, Private Detective Services. The address was different from the one on the license. Located in a modest office building downtown. His heart pounding. Thomas also discovered something else he'd initially overlooked. A small, handwritten note tucked behind the cash. In careful script, it read, "Follow the thread. Trust no one. The truth is worth more than money." Our ma'am, the note changed everything. This wasn't just a lost wallet. This was a message, a puzzle, maybe even a trap. But why would a dead woman's wallet end up in the hands of a homeless man? And what thread was he supposed to follow? Thomas looked at the money again. $5,000 could change his life, but something told him this money came with strings attached. Dangerous strings. He thought about walking away, about keeping the cash and forgetting he'd ever seen Rebecca. Martinez's name. But the note nagged at him. Someone had wanted this wallet found. Someone had wanted him to find it. The decision to visit the investigator's office wasn't rational. Thomas knew he was walking into something he didn't understand, something that might be dangerous. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond just surviving another day. The thread Rebecca had mentioned, he was going to follow it, no matter where it led. The office building was in a rough part of downtown, the kind of place where people minded their own business and asked no questions. Thomas climbed 4 flights of stairs, his wet clothes leaving a trail behind him. The office door was unmarked, except for a small placard, Martinez Investigations, Suite 4C. Thomas knocked, not really expecting an answer. To his surprise, the door opened almost immediately. A woman in her 50s stood before him, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She looked at Thomas, then at the wallet in his hands, and smiled. "Mr. Wright," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "We've been waiting for you." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. She knew his name. She knew he was coming. And suddenly, he realized that finding the wallet hadn't been an accident at all. He'd been selected, chosen, manipulated into this moment. But by whom? And why? The woman who had called him by name led Thomas into a small but tidy office. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, and a large desk dominated the center of the room. What struck Thomas most was how normal everything looked. No mysterious documents, no threatening shadows, just the ordinary workspace of a private investigator. "My name is Elena Rodriguez," the woman said, gesturing for Thomas to sit in a chair across from her desk. "I was Rebecca Martinez's partner. We worked together for 12 years before she died." Thomas remained standing, the wallet clutched in his hands like a shield. "How do you know my name? How did you know I was coming?" Elena smiled sadly. "Because Rebecca planned it this way. She knew someone would eventually find that wallet, and she knew that person would try to return it. She was counting on human decency, even in the worst circumstances. But she's dead," Thomas said. "The doorman told me she died over a year ago." 14 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days ago, Elena confirmed. "Car accident on Lakeshore Drive. Or at least, that's what the police report says. That's what everyone believes. But Rebecca didn't think it was an accident. She thought someone killed her for what she knew." Thomas felt the room spinning around him. What did she know? Elena opened a file cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. Rebecca was investigating a case involving City Councilman Richard Brennan. Nothing too exciting. His wife suspected he was having an affair. But during her investigation, Rebecca stumbled onto something much bigger. She discovered that Brennan was taking bribes from construction companies in exchange for city contracts. Millions of dollars in illegal payments. The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Richard Brennan. The same Richard Brennan who had been on the city council when Thomas's construction company had been mysteriously passed over for a major project 5 years ago. The same Richard Brennan whose company had gotten the contract instead, the contract that would have saved Thomas's business. She gathered evidence, Elena continued. Documents, photographs, recorded conversations. Enough to send Brennan to prison for 20 years. But before she could go to the authorities, she started receiving threats. Someone broke into her apartment. Her phone was tapped. She was being followed. Thomas sank into the chair, his mind reeling. So she faked her death? No, Elena said quietly. She really died. But she saw it coming. In the weeks before her death, she created a contingency plan. She made copies of all her evidence and hid them in different locations around the city. Then she created that wallet with her old identification, a significant amount of money, and clues to help the right person find the truth. But why me? Thomas asked. Why not go to the police or the FBI or a reporter? Elena's expression grew grim. Because Brennan has connections everywhere. Police, media, city government. Rebecca didn't know who she could trust. So she decided to trust a stranger, someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain. Thomas looked at the money in the wallet, understanding finally dawning on him. This isn't just lost money. It's payment. The first payment, Elena confirmed. If you help us expose the truth about Richard Brennan, there's more. Much more. Rebecca set aside $50,000 to ensure her killer would be brought to justice. $50,000. The number was almost incomprehensible to Thomas. It was more money than he'd ever had, more than enough to start over, to find his daughter, to reclaim his life. But it also meant danger, meant going up against one of the most powerful men in the city. What exactly are you asking me to do? Thomas said. Elena slid a piece of paper across the desk. Tomorrow night, there's a charity gala at the Palmer House Hotel. Brennan will be there, along with several of the contractors involved in the bribery scheme. Rebecca hid a key piece of evidence in Brennan's private office, documents that prove his guilt beyond any doubt. We need someone to retrieve them. Thomas stared at the paper, his mouth dry. You want me to break into a city councilman's office? We want you to get justice, Elena said. For Rebecca, for yourself, for everyone Brennan has hurt with his corruption. Thomas thought about his construction company, about the employees who had lost their jobs, about his wife who had left him when the money ran out, about his daughter who had stopped calling. Richard Brennan hadn't just taken contracts. He'd taken lives, dreams, futures. If I do this, Thomas said slowly, and if I get caught, I'll go to prison. Elena nodded. That's the risk. But if you don't do this, Brennan will keep destroying lives. And Rebecca's death will mean nothing. Thomas spent the night in a cheap motel room that Elena had paid for, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with his decision. The hot shower had been the first he'd had in weeks, and the clean clothes Elena had provided made him feel almost human. Again, but nothing could wash away the weight of what he was being asked to do. By morning, he had made his choice. Richard Brennan had taken everything from him 5 years ago. Now, with Rebecca's evidence and Elena's help, he had a chance to take something back. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had been hurt by Brennan's corruption. Elena provided him with a detailed plan. The charity gala would provide the perfect cover, hundreds of people, plenty of distractions, and Brennan would be occupied with his public appearances. Thomas would pose as a member of the catering staff, gain access to the hotel's service areas, and from there make his way to Brennan's temporary office on the mezzanine level. The transformation was remarkable. Elena's contacts provided Thomas with a server's uniform, fake identification, and a crash course in hotel procedures. Looking at himself in the mirror, clean-shaven and properly dressed, Thomas barely recognized the man staring back at him. He looked like the person he used to be before everything fell apart. The Palmer House Hotel was a world Thomas had forgotten existed. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and the kind of opulence that reminded him of everything he'd lost. The charity gala was in full swing, with Chicago's elite mingling over champagne and canapes, while a string quartet played in the background. Thomas moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility, carrying trays and blending into the background. He spotted Richard Brennan across the room, a tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit, surrounded by admirers and sycophants. The man who had destroyed his life was laughing at some joke, completely unaware that his past was about to catch up with him. The plan worked perfectly. Thomas slipped away from the main ballroom during a shift change, made his way to the service elevator, and rode it to the mezzanine level. Brennan's temporary office was exactly where Elena had said it would be, behind a door marked Private Authorized Personnel Only. The lock was electronic, but Elena had provided him with a key card obtained through her investigation contacts. Thomas's heart pounded as he slipped inside, closing the door behind him. The office was modest but elegant, with a view of the Chicago River and walls lined with photographs of Brennan with various political figures. Rebecca's evidence was hidden, exactly where Elena had said it would be, taped to the underside of a filing cabinet drawer. A thick envelope containing photographs, bank records, and recorded conversations. Thomas quickly stuffed it inside his jacket, his hands shaking with adrenaline. That's when he heard voices in the hallway. Brennan's voice, getting closer. Thomas looked around frantically for another exit, but there was none. He was trapped. The door handle turned, and Thomas pressed himself against the wall behind the door, hoping against hope that whoever entered wouldn't see him, but his luck had run out. The door opened fully, and Richard Brennan stepped inside, followed by two other men in expensive suits. "I'm telling you, something's not right," Brennan was saying. "My sources say Martinez's partner has been asking questions, stirring up trouble." Thomas held his breath, the evidence burning against his chest. He was 3 feet away from the man who had destroyed his life, close enough to see the worry lines around Brennan's eyes, close enough to hear the fear in his voice. "Elena Rodriguez is a problem," one of the other men said. "Maybe it's time we dealt with her the same way we dealt with Martinez." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. They were planning to kill Elena, just like they had killed Rebecca. And here he was, trapped in a room with 3 murderers, carrying evidence that could destroy them all. Thomas knew he had seconds before they discovered him. The evidence in his jacket felt like it was burning through his clothes, and his heart was pounding so loudly he was sure they could hear it. But then something unexpected happened. The man who had been talking about dealing with Elena Rodriguez stepped closer to where Thomas was hiding. And Thomas recognized him. Detective Mike Sullivan? The same Detective Sullivan who had investigated Thomas's construction company for irregularities 5 years ago. The same Detective Sullivan who had found nothing wrong with Brennan's company winning the contract. The corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined. "We need to move fast," Sullivan was saying. "Rodriguez knows too much, and if she's recruited someone to help her, we could have a real problem." Thomas realized this was his moment. If he stayed hidden, Elena would die, and Rebecca's evidence would never see the light of day. But if he acted now, he might be able to save her and expose the truth. The homeless man who had nothing to lose suddenly had everything to fight for. Thomas stepped out from behind the door, the evidence envelope clearly visible in his hands. "Too late," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. "Elena Rodriguez isn't your problem anymore. I am." The 3 men spun around, their faces showing shock, then anger, then calculation. Brennan's hand moved toward his jacket, but Thomas was faster. He held up his phone, showing that he was recording. "Everything you just said is being live-streamed to Elena Rodriguez," Thomas lied smoothly. "She's already contacted the FBI, the media, and the state attorney general. Your corruption ends tonight." What happened next would be talked about for years. Sullivan lunged for Thomas, but Thomas was ready. Years of living on the streets had taught him how to fight, how to survive. He dodged Sullivan's grab and pushed past the other man, racing for the door. The chase through the Palmer House Hotel was like something from a movie. Thomas ran through the service corridors, down the stairs, and into the main ballroom, still carrying Rebecca's evidence. Behind him, he could hear Brennan shouting for security, claiming Thomas was a thief. But Thomas had one advantage they didn't expect. He knew what it was like to be invisible, to move through a crowd without being noticed. He slipped off the server's jacket, messed up his hair, and within seconds looked like just another hotel guest who had wandered into the wrong area. The real genius of Rebecca's plan became clear in that moment. She hadn't just hidden evidence. She had created a situation where the truth would come out no matter what. Elena Rodriguez was indeed waiting outside the hotel, along with FBI agents and reporters she had contacted. The live stream Thomas had claimed to be making was actually real. Elena had been recording everything through a hidden camera Thomas had been wearing. Richard Brennan was arrested that night, along with Detective Sullivan and 6 other city officials. The evidence Rebecca had gathered, combined with the recorded confession from the hotel office, was enough to bring down the entire corruption network. Thomas Wright, the homeless man who had found a wallet full of money, became the key witness in the biggest corruption scandal in Chicago's history. The $50,000 Elena had promised him was just the beginning. The FBI's reward for information leading to the arrests was 10 times that amount. But more importantly, Thomas had found something he thought he'd lost forever: his self-respect. He used the money to start a new construction company, this time focusing on affordable housing for the homeless. He reunited with his daughter, who had been searching for him for years. And he made sure that Rebecca Martinez's sacrifice was never forgotten. The truth really was worth more than money. And sometimes the most unlikely hero is exactly the one the world needs. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes can come from the most unexpected places, then please subscribe to our channel. Every week, we bring you real stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Because in a world full of darkness, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to do the right thing to change everything. Hit that subscribe button and join us for more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in humanity.